The 17th of January, 1945, northern Luzon, Philippines. The jungle breathed with him, dense, suffocating, alive. Sergeant William R. Lely crouched in the mud beneath a canopy, so thick the afternoon sun existed only as fractured golden needles piercing through mahogany leaves. His breath came slow, deliberate. Around him, the air hung heavy with the smell of rotting vegetation, gun oil, and the distant metallic tang of diesel exhaust. Somewhere beyond the tree line, engines growled low, mechanical, predatory. Japanese Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, advancing in formation through the valley below. 12 of them. Their steel hulls glinted dully through breaks in the foliage, turrets swiveling like the heads of hunting animals. Lely's hands rested on the launcher of a 2.36-inch M9, a one super bazooka, its tube still warm from the morning's skirmish. He was alone. His squad had scattered during the ambush 2 hours earlier, scattered or dead, he wasn't sure which. The Japanese infantry had come first, silent and swift, materializing from the jungle like ghosts. Then the tanks. Always the tanks. And now, pressed into the earth with nothing but a rocket launcher, 6 rounds, and a dry canteen, Lely did something strange. He whistled, low and soft. A tune his father used to hum back in Kentucky, something about a lonesome valley. The sound drifted through the trees, almost innocent, almost absurd. And then he moved. To understand what happened in those 3 hours, you must first understand what brought American soldiers like William Lely to this blood-soaked corner of the Pacific, and what brought the Japanese Imperial Army to believe with religious certainty that they could never be broken. The Philippines had been under Japanese occupation since 1942, when General Douglas MacArthur made his famous retreat and equally famous promise. "I shall return." By January 1945, he had. The American campaign to reclaim the islands was brutal, methodical, and unforgiving. The Japanese High Command, knowing the strategic value of Luzon, had concentrated over 250,000 troops there under General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the so-called Tiger of Malaya. These were not the green recruits of island garrisons. These were hardened soldiers who had swept through Southeast Asia with terrifying efficiency, men who had been told since childhood that surrender was worse than death, that the emperor was divine, and that Japan's destiny was to rule the Pacific. They had been trained to fight to the last man, to sacrifice everything for the homeland. They believed in Bushido, the way of the warrior, a code that romanticized death and despised weakness. But by 1945, something had begun to crack in that certainty. The Japanese soldiers moving through Luzon that January expected to die. But they also expected the Americans to falter, to buckle under the weight of Japan's fanatical resistance, to grow weary and negotiate. They had been told that the soft, decadent Americans, raised on luxury and individualism, could never match the spiritual resolve of the Japanese warrior. They had been told that American industry, while vast, could not sustain a war across 2 oceans. They had been told that democracy made men weak. What they encountered instead was something their ideology had no framework to explain. A soldier like William Lely, alone in the jungle, outnumbered and outgunned, who did not retreat, did not surrender, and did not stop. Lely had grown up in the hills of eastern Kentucky, the son of a coal miner and a schoolteacher. He had known poverty, the kind that made you resourceful, that taught you to fix what was broken and make do with what you had. He had hunted squirrels with his grandfather's rifle, learned to track game through dense forest, learned patience. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, he was 19 years old, working at a lumber mill. He enlisted 3 days later. By 1945, he was a veteran of New Guinea and Leyte, a sergeant in the 6th Infantry Division, and he had seen enough death to know that fear was a choice you made every single day. That morning, his platoon had been moving through a narrow valley when the Japanese opened fire. Machine gun nests, mortars, and then the tanks emerging from camouflaged positions like iron demons. The Americans scattered. Lely had grabbed the bazooka and whatever ammunition he could carry, then disappeared into the jungle. The official after-action report, filed 3 weeks later, would describe what happened next in dry, bureaucratic prose. Sergeant Lely, acting alone and without support, engaged and destroyed 12 enemy armoured vehicles over a period of approximately 3 hours. But the report could not capture the reality of those hours. The first tank came down the trail at 1,430 hours. Lely was positioned 30 yards upslope, hidden behind the exposed roots of a banyan tree. He could hear the crew inside, their voices muffled, casual. They thought the Americans had fled. He sighted down the tube, exhaled, and fired. The rocket left the launcher with a crack like lightning splitting a tree, trailing white smoke. It struck the turret ring, the weak point where the turret met the hull, and detonated. The explosion was immediate, catastrophic. Flame and black smoke erupted from the hatches. The tank lurched to a stop, blocking the trail. Lely didn't wait to see the crew bail out. He was already moving, slipping deeper into the jungle, circling to a new position. The Japanese infantry began shouting, firing blindly into the trees. He counted to 30. Then he whistled again. That same low, mocking tune. It enraged them. He could hear them crashing through the underbrush, trying to pinpoint the sound. But Lely was already 200 yards away, setting up for the second shot. The Japanese had underestimated the American capacity for individual initiative. In the Imperial Army, orders flowed downward, and deviation was unthinkable. Soldiers were taught to obey, to sacrifice, to subsume the self into the collective will. The idea that a single enemy soldier could operate independently, make tactical decisions on the fly, and inflict massive damage without command authority, it was outside their tactical doctrine. It was, in their worldview, unmilitary, chaotic. And yet, here was Lely, a product of American pragmatism, doing exactly that. He had no radio, no reinforcements, no orders, just a weapon, a target-rich environment, and the improvisational instinct drilled into every American GI. Figure it out, adapt, survive. This was not the behavior of a weak man from a soft nation. This was something else entirely. The second and third tanks fell within 20 minutes of each other. Lely used the terrain, luring them into narrow defiles where their mobility was limited, where one disabled tank would block the others. He fired, displaced, reloaded, fired again. The rockets were not precision instruments. They were finicky, temperamental, prone to misfires. But Lely had trained with the bazooka for months, knew its quirks, knew how to brace it against his shoulder to absorb the recoil, knew the exact moment to squeeze the trigger. Each time he fired, he moved immediately. The Japanese began to learn. They started suppressing the tree line with machine gun fire before advancing, sending infantry ahead to scout. But Lely was always one step ahead, circling, patient, methodical. He had hunted deer in the Kentucky hills the same way. Let them come to you, control the space, wait for the shot. By 1600 hours, 5 tanks were burning wrecks along the trail. The Japanese commander, desperate and furious, ordered the remaining tanks to advance in line abreast, off the trail, crushing through the jungle itself. It was a bold move. It was also a fatal one. Lely had anticipated it. He had scouted the terrain the previous day during the platoon's advance, and knew that 100 yards to the east, the ground dropped away sharply into a ravine hidden by vegetation. The Japanese tanks, moving blind through the trees, didn't see it until too late. The lead tank tipped forward, its nose plunging into the ravine, tracks spinning uselessly. The others halted, bunching together, trying to maneuver. Lely was waiting. He fired twice in rapid succession, 2 rockets, 2 tanks. One burst into flames immediately, ammunition cooking off inside with a sound like firecrackers. The other lurched sideways, its track blown off, and slammed into a tree. The crew bailed out, scrambling for cover. Lely shot the first man through the scope of his carbine, then vanished back into the jungle. The Japanese infantry, now fully committed to finding him, swept through the area in a skirmish line. He let them pass. Then he circled behind them and destroyed the 8th tank from the rear, where the armor was thinnest. There is a moment in every battle where belief collapses, where the certainty that sustained you, the ideology, the training, the promises, cracks and falls away, and you see the situation as it truly is. For the Japanese soldiers in that valley, that moment came when they realized they were being hunted by a single man. One American, alone, who had destroyed more than half their armored column and showed no signs of stopping. It was not supposed to be possible. The Americans were supposed to be technologically dependent, unable to function without overwhelming firepower and air support. They were supposed to lack spiritual strength. And yet, here was a man who fought like a ghost, who used the jungle better than they did, who turned their own tactics against them. The whistle, that infuriating, mocking whistle, became a psychological weapon. Every time they heard it, they knew another tank was about to die. Some of the younger soldiers began to panic. Officers shouted orders, trying to maintain discipline, but doubt had taken root. By 1700 hours, Lely had 1 rocket left, 9 tanks destroyed, 3 remaining, but their commanders had had enough. They began to withdraw, reversing awkwardly down the trail, machine guns firing blindly into the jungle. Lely tracked them through the trees, moving parallel to their line of retreat. He could have let them go. He was out of anti-tank rounds. But he had spotted something earlier, a cache of Japanese ammunition, abandoned during the initial ambush. Among the crates was a Type 99 magnetic anti-tank mine. He retrieved it, jogging through the jungle with the weight of the mine slung over his shoulder, and set it hastily on the trail where the retreating tanks would pass. Then he climbed a tree and waited. The first tank rolled over the mine. The explosion ripped through the undercarriage, lifting the 15-ton vehicle off the ground. It crashed back down, immobilized, smoke pouring from the engine compartment. The other 2 tanks accelerated, desperate now, fleeing toward Japanese lines. Lely let them go. He had run out of ammunition and energy. He climbed down from the tree, retrieved his bazooka, and walked back into the jungle. Behind him, 10 Japanese tanks burned. 2 escaped. The valley was silent except for the crackle of flames and the distant sound of small arms fire. What William Lely carried that day beyond the bazooka, beyond the ammunition, was something intangible, something the Japanese had not accounted for in their calculations. It was not just courage or skill, though he had both. It was the product of a society that valued individual agency, that taught its citizens to think for themselves, to question authority when necessary, to solve problems through improvisation rather than rigid adherence to doctrine. American soldiers were trained to lead from any position, to take initiative when command structures broke down, to trust their own judgment. This was not chaos. This was democracy applied to warfare. The Japanese system, for all its discipline and ferocity, could not replicate it. Their soldiers were taught to obey unto death, and they did, with heartbreaking bravery. But they were not taught to adapt, to improvise, to become, when necessary, an army of one. And so, when a soldier like Lely appeared self-reliant, resourceful, unwilling to quit, they had no counter. Their ideology could not explain him, and what you cannot explain, you cannot defeat. That evening, Lely made contact with American lines. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and covered in mud. He reported the engagement in the same flat, matter-of-fact tone he used to describe everything. His commanding officer initially didn't believe him. It was only when reconnaissance patrols confirmed the wreckage of 10 Japanese tanks along a 3-mile stretch of jungle trail that the story was corroborated. Lely was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross, though he never received it. Bureaucratic delays and lost paperwork saw to that. He didn't care. He survived the war, went home to Kentucky, married his high school sweetheart, and worked as a machinist for 37 years. He rarely spoke about the Philippines. When asked, he would shrug and say, "I just did what needed doing." That phrase, "what needed doing," is perhaps the most American sentence ever spoken. It contains no grandiosity, no ideology, no claim to exceptionalism, just simple, unadorned competence. But it is also, in its own way, profoundly ideological. It reflects a worldview in which the individual matters, in which one person can make a difference, in which you are not a cog in a machine but a free agent responsible for your own actions. The Japanese soldiers who faced Lely that day had been told their entire lives that the individual was nothing, that only the collective, the emperor, the nation, the spirit of Japan mattered. And in the end, it was a man who believed in his own worth, his own agency, who destroyed them. The whistle became part of the legend. Other soldiers in the 6th Infantry Division heard the story and embellished it, turning Lely into a folk hero, a ghost in the jungle who taunted the enemy with music before obliterating them. Some versions claimed he sang full songs, others that he used bird calls to coordinate phantom reinforcements. None of it was true, but the symbolism was potent. The whistle represented something the Japanese could not abide: irreverence, mockery, the refusal to treat war as a sacred, solemn ritual. To the Americans, war was a job, a dirty, a necessary job that you did with grim competence and then went home. To the Japanese, war was transcendence, a path to spiritual purity through sacrifice. Lely's whistle, echoing through the jungle, was a rejection of that entire worldview. It said, "This is not sacred, you are not invincible, and I am not afraid." In the months that followed, the 6th Infantry Division pushed north through Luzon, encountering fanatical resistance at every turn. Japanese soldiers charged American positions with bayonets, detonated themselves with grenades, fought from caves until they starved. The brutality was immense, the casualties staggering, but something had shifted. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since the early days of the war, had crumbled. Stories like Lely's of individual Americans doing the impossible, of soldiers who refused to quit even when logic said they should spread through both armies. For the Americans, they were proof that democracy could fight, that free men could be just as tough, just as determined, as any fanatic. For the Japanese, they were demoralizing, a glimpse of an enemy who would not break, who possessed resources and resolve far beyond what propaganda had promised. The soldiers who survived the war would carry those lessons home. Some would speak of them with bitterness, others with a grudging respect, but none would forget. There is a photograph taken in June 1945, after the fall of Luzon. It shows Sergeant William Lely standing beside a destroyed Japanese Type 97 tank, its turret blown clean off, hull blackened by fire. He is not smiling. His face is gaunt, eyes distant. The photographer, a Signal Corps lieutenant, later wrote that Lely seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention, eager to get back to his unit. The photo was never published during the war. Censors deemed it too focused on individual heroism, worried it would undermine the collective effort narrative. But it survived in archives, a testament to a moment when one man, with a weapon and a will, changed the outcome of a battle. The tank in the photo is now a museum piece in Manila, a rusting monument to a forgotten engagement. Visitors walk past it without knowing the story. The plaque mentions American forces, but not Lely's name. History is like that. It swallows the details, preserves the broad strokes, forgets the individuals who made the difference. But the truth remains, buried in after-action reports and fading memories. One man, 12 tanks, 3 hours. What Lely represented, what all soldiers like him represented, was the paradox at the heart of American power in the Second World War. The United States was a nation of overwhelming industrial might. Yes, it could produce more tanks, more planes, more ships than any other country on Earth. But that abundance was not what won the war. What won the war was the willingness of individual Americans to use that abundance with initiative, creativity, and relentless determination. The Japanese had expected American soldiers to be soft, dependent on their machines, unable to fight without material superiority. What they discovered instead was that American soldiers were most dangerous when stripped of everything, when forced to rely on nothing but themselves, because they had been raised in a culture that taught them they mattered, that their lives had value, that they were capable of greatness. That belief, that simple, democratic belief in the worth of the individual, was the weapon the Axis could never counter. It could not be destroyed by propaganda, could not be bombed from the air, could not be starved out or ground down. It was, in the end, indestructible. The jungle where Lely fought is quiet now. The trails have been reclaimed by vegetation, the wreckage long since salvaged or buried. Farmers plant rice in the valleys where tanks once burned. Children play in the rivers where men once bled. The war is memory, fading with each passing year, but the lesson endures. Freedom is not passive. Democracy is not weak. And sometimes, when the world is collapsing around you, when you are alone and outgunned and afraid, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to quit. Whistle in the face of the enemy. And do what needs doing. That is the legacy of men like William Lely. Not the medals, not the glory, but the quiet, unyielding certainty that one person, fighting for something worth fighting for, can change everything. The Japanese learned that lesson in the jungles of Luzon. The world learned it in the ashes of the Second World War. And it remains true, as true now as it was on that January afternoon in 1945, when a Kentucky coal miner's son destroyed 12 tanks and walked away whistling.